Welcome back, everyone, to Mastering Change. Today's conversation is one we wanted to have for a long time because it speaks to something at the heart of both trauma and healing: identity.
And more specifically, gender identity. What it means, how it's shaped, and why it matters so much, especially for young people. We're joined by Rachel Hulstein-Lowe, a gender diversity expert, parent coach, and mum of two, whose personal and professional worlds collided when her own child came out as non-binary.
Rachel's work focuses on supporting anxious kids and their anxious parents, many of whom are navigating complex experiences of gender. But what really stands out is how she helps parents and professionals move from fear to understanding and from silence to support.
In this episode, we talk about the difference between sex and gender, why the binary feels so rigid, and how that's more cultural than biological. We also explore what it means to truly see someone, especially when who they are challenges everything you thought you knew.
Whether you're a clinician, a parent, or just someone trying to understand the world a little better, this conversation is honest, moving, and important. Here we go. Rachel, it's a pleasure to welcome you to our podcast today. Thank you for joining us.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Welcome, Rachel. It would be great if you could explain to our audience, just introduce yourself in your own words to our audience.
So I'm Rachel Hulstein-Lowe. I am a gender diversity expert. I'm a parent coach. I'm a mom of two. You can probably tell from my accent that I have a cold and that I live in Massachusetts. I'm in the States. And my specialty, I've said for a long time, is supporting anxious kids and their anxious parents. But a very growing niche of that population has been gender diverse kids and young adults and the people who love them. And unless you're literally living under a rock, you will well know that the political climate, particularly in the United States over the last 5 years, around gender diversity and trans health issues has become pretty dim. So my work with these kids has become particularly poignant. I've done that work for about a decade, and roughly 4 years ago, my own kids, I'm a mom of two, my eldest came out as non-binary. So completely unexpected, having been in this field doing this work for as long as I had. But, you know, my two passions, my work and my family, have absolutely collided, which has made my purpose, my whys are completely in alignment. I'm really aware at the desire for people in our professions to know about gender diversity, but there's a lot of gaps in knowledge and a lot of gaps in kind of understanding. And I'd love to be a bridge builder. I would love to bring more of a spotlight onto the needs of these kids and these families.
I think that's such a fantastic mission because I think there is also, yes, a lot of kind of questions and people, but there's a lot of good intention, that is, where do you channel that good intention and how do you execute it in an appropriate way? But before we dive into that, I'm going to hand over to Araminta, who's going to just ask you the question from the card game that we use in every podcast.
The card that I'm going to pull, I just a random selection of cards, by the way, out of the pack, and the card I have drawn says, something I grew up thinking was normal, but later found out wasn't.
Well, I mean, I call myself a gender diversity expert. I didn't think about gender and the difference between gender and sex until I was well into adulthood. I didn't understand that as a social construct. I didn't understand that in any way, at all the way that I do now. And there's still learning to do. I don't know that on any diversity topic our learning ends. I think there's always more growth, more edges that we find. But certainly growing up, I thought of myself as a girl, and there were girls and boys. And that was never questioned. And there were very clear guidelines about what girls do and girls play and girls like and wear and vice versa for boys. And I think that's still very much intact. But gratefully, I do think there's a growing dialogue and a growing willingness to shake that up a little bit and see things more on a spectrum as opposed to really strict boxes. But that's definitely something that I learned later.
I think that's a really lovely place to start with our audience in the context of how you relate to this field. Can you describe to us the difference between gender and sex and that spectrum as you see it?
Yeah, so there's a lot of misinformation out there about those two terms. Sex, as I understand it, and what I know, what I read is sex is determined by our chromosomes, by our genitalia, by a variety of things that are presented at birth, and we're assigned that at birth. There's always been more than one. There's always been more than two. So I think that's also a misconception that there's always been what is commonly been called intersex, and those individuals who are presenting with either chromosomal differences or genitalial differences that would not classify them in one sex or the other. Very often a doctor has made a decision, kind of even sometimes without parental consideration, kind of making a decision that this would be best for. There's been, these are not widespread events, but they do happen. When people talk about biology, it's just biology. There's a lot that goes into the biology that actually there's a myriad of presentation just around sex, but we kind of our brains don't like all that complexity. Our brains tend to like things to be kind of in boxes, and our medical model has really adhered to this idea of there being a binary around sex. Gender is what we experience internally. So gender is what we experience on the inside in terms of how we relate to the body that we're born into and how we relate to those social ideas about presentation, whether that be in dress or hairstyle or chosen interests or tone of voice or right. All manners of things that get gendered, in many cases without us even realizing it. But gender is much more of a personal case-by-case kind of experience. So that's how I understand those two terms. That's what I try to bring to my client population. I appreciate the question.
So tell us then, the reason we're together today is to talk about how your work, your frameworks, modalities relate to that field of trauma, mental health and well-being, and what it is that you wish our audience knew or understood. I talk about the audience here, but if we were talking in the context of our events, or what is it that you want to democratize or share or empower people with to be able to lean into that good intention? There are many people with it who want to be more literate in this space, who want to be better equipped to support, engage those, everybody.
There's a lot of fear around getting it wrong. And I think for a lot of clinicians that puts them in a place of then, well, I'm just not going to talk about that. I'm just not going to go there. I'm not going to take that case. I'm not going to have that conversation because I don't want to get it wrong and it scares me, or it feels so far outside of kind of what they've known. And that, right, that's a conversation stopper. Right? The dialogue ends. And unfortunately, I think, and particularly in these times, the absence of being able to dialogue, right, the unwillingness then to engage with something that's unfamiliar and unknown, does allow misinformation to spread and does allow things to happen, unfortunately, to marginalized groups, including transgender diverse individuals, that we would never want to have happen to anyone. So I guess I'm wanting many things. On a very simple level, I'm wanting people to lean into a conversation that would otherwise might be scary or intimidating to have. Mainly in many cases because there's just that unknown, unfamiliar factor. So wanting to create a space where it's safe to say, I don't understand what that means, or I haven't heard that before. I interviewed over the course of 2024, I interviewed roughly 25 different parents, both parent pairs and individual parents across the United States, both in red and blue states. Hopefully your audience knows what I mean by that. So accepting states and really transphobic states, about their experience of raising gender diverse kids. And one of the first questions I ask those parents is, how has raising a gender diverse kid impacted your own concept of gender? Along with a question about, what are your identities? And I had a number of parents who said, well, nearly all parents said it changed things dramatically. And I had a couple of parents who said, nobody's ever asked me that question about my identities. And that really threw me back. I did not anticipate that. But what it told me is that there's such a need for us to think about these ideas, that there's many in our community around us who have no choice but to think about them, right? They're thinking about them all the time, every day. They're faced with that kind of challenge around the very basics in terms of like their gender presentation, every single day. So it's not an option where they're not waiting for somebody to ask them. They're being questioned just by a look, right, on the metro, or crossing the street, or entering their school building, or getting on the bus, or right, entering their doctor's office, right? That's something they're facing all the time. So just wanting to open up kind of that understanding, and make that a little more comfortable space to dialogue about, as well as help people appreciate what it means for these kids and these parents to be living in very transphobic times, what that means for their mental health, what does that mean for kind of their day-to-day living, and how might we be able to support them.
Just transphobia and the kind of rigidity of the society's need to be binary. Why do you think that is? Why do you think we are, or so many people are, so rigid in this? We have to be binary. Do you have any? Is it?
Well, I think I just want to add in there, because for me, I was seeing two things there. The people that do the looks, that create the discomfort, have got that kind of perception of, you don't fit into my binary view of this world.
Yes.
But then there's all this other swathe of individuals who are embracing and open and well-intentioned, as we talked about, but that have got an underlying fear of getting it wrong and being perceived as the person that's got a very strong. So the challenge I think plays out is that you've got visible and visceral, representation for
I that question, answered. Like, I don't understand why. Where does that need for the binary come from?
I was not a gender studies major. Right? I was an English major and then did a master's degree in clinical social work. So I've read a lot and learned a lot. But my take on the binary is that it's a patriarchal byproduct. It's necessary in a patriarchal society to have these really strict ideas about what's masculine, what's feminine. Without it, right, kind of that power becomes more dispersed, and that's not a desired outcome in a true patriarchy, and in a capitalist society, particularly in the States, which has become more and more conservative, those ideas maintain a certain power base. And so the threat of an empowered, not just an empowered woman, but an empowered, kind of diaspora, right? This whole spectrum that completely shakes up the power structure as it is. It's incredibly threatening. It's threatening also at a level of like, there's a certain kind of power that then is seen as the predominant, as the top of the hierarchy, right? Like we've heard very recently. I mean, it's getting very explicit, actually. Like Mark Zuckerberg very recently, I don't know, talked about how we need more masculine energy.
I heard that part. I heard this.
Right? And on the one hand, it's kind of like, what in the world is he talking about? And on the other hand, I think he is speaking to this idea of a hierarchy being a very kind of traditional, aggressive, top-down type of power structure.
But I think it just also, there is this history gives us lots of frame of reference to a binary view. Religious history, Adam and Eve. You look at even, and you talk about, speaking the energy healing world, the divine feminine, your feminine and your masculine. We talk this, so it doesn't necessarily need to be negative, but I think there is so much cultural and contextual frame of reference to a binary approach. I think the same thing that's driving that is what drives the fear, because you don't have the frame of reference as to how to embrace a non-binary approach confidently, because there aren't those cultural references. There aren't the things that you can easily draw from to kind of show up. We learn through experiences, we learn by watching others, we learn from cultural, from movies and TV, and we learn from everything that exists around us. And because it's so often underrepresented, misunderstood, and continually we get this, message around binary, even though you're willing to embrace it, there is that kind of fear around, how do I do that meaningfully?
I think that's true, but what also gets missed is that for millennia, many indigenous cultures around the world have had a kind of a third option, if you will, and they're often the spiritual guides, the shamans,
Yeah.
they're the bridge builders. They're seen as really the bodies of wisdom, because they have this complexity, right, in their presentation in their world. So it has always been with us, but we, our Western worlds, our colonized world, has done quite an effective job of eradicating those ideas.
How do we shift that, Rachel? Because that's the bit, isn't it? Like you say, there are frames of reference. There are, teachings. There are, there is wisdom that can be transferred.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In your work, how
and in my work, I'm trying to do that right on the one-to-one, one family at a time type level. Part of doing those interviews that I mentioned before is to hopefully write a book and develop a larger offering where I can reach more people. But on the one-to-one, what I'm trying to do is show that when a young person says, this is who I am, our number one job is to believe them, right? That at first pass, believe them. We don't understand it, but believing allows them to explore, to ask questions, and to do that in the company of a loving, supportive parent, right? That they're not on their own, that they get affirmed. And in doing so, I'll tell you a story about some parents that came to me in my practice around the issue of they were really misaligned in how they were supporting their trans son, and were really struggling about how to meet each other, and then how to best to support him. They had really different ideas about how to help him. And I met with them as a couple several times, and then over the course of those meetings, it was a hetero couple, and the dad at some point indicated, I think it would be easier for me to meet with you one-on-one because there's some things I think it would be easier for me to say. And which I thought was so brave. And what those subsequent conversations with him allowed was for us to start to identify what were the biggest pain points and hangups for him. What was preventing him from moving forward with acceptance and affirmation. And he told a story about this picture of his son from a much younger child self, like 5 years old, with this long flowing hair, and it was still hanging in their house. And he said, every time I see that photo, like, that is just the spirit of my kid. And it breaks my heart to think that that's gone. And that really allowed us, like, okay, there's something about that image that feels like the spirit. And what is it? What are the aspects of that spirit that aren't about the long blonde flowing hair, right? That aren't about that freckly skin, right? Aren't about kind of that 4-year-old presentation, that are still within your child. They haven't gone away. And that was really painful. It meant a lot of grieving for him. But I hope this is answering your question of, like, what I tried to help him do is identify kind of the complexity that all of that, right? He was having an opportunity to see the wholeness of his kid and not just this vision he kind of had locked in from 4 years old. That embracing his child's identity allowed him to see kind of his child as a whole being, as opposed to just kind of this one aspect.
I think what you're saying is so important, and what it does is it emphasizes how our society puts so much emphasis on looks, external looks, right? On what a masculine looks like, or what a feminine looks like, what I show up as. I might have, the body of a woman, the hair of a woman, the face of a woman, but deep inside, or just inside, I feel, and I do regularly feel, very masculine. I am feeling, or whatever masculine is, from the thing, that's what you know, I would never back in the day have felt brave enough to kind of sort of say that. That's just, people would almost say, you're a girl and you're acting like a boy, kind of thing, when I was growing up. And I think it's this complexity that people have, that there isn't, like, I really liked what you said about the indigenous kind of people, that could be all, I think, all in one, but just his spirit of his son.
Yes.
Still there. It's still, it's not just because how he's changed externally, nothing inside has changed.
Not inside. Right.
That perhaps more peace.
Another thing that was really fascinating about that case, and I think is true of a lot of the dads I work with in particular, particularly in hetero couples, is that his role to his child was also shifting, because he really took on this very paternal, very patriarchal idea about protecting his kid, right? Protecting his daughter, who is now his son. And he really had to shift into a different way of relating. And that like gives me chills now to think about that. I mean, it was so poignant, and it was so real. It made so much sense that he was struggling in that way. That was fundamentally different than the mom, right? Mom wasn't it was a different kind of shift for her than it was for him. And I think that's a really common experience. Again, I also think these kinds of challenges, right? As parents, we have agendas for our kids, no matter what, no matter who they are. We do. So that kind of challenge, I think, is just a universal. And I think that's part of my message too, is I want to say we are really not that different in terms of the parenting challenges. We're just adding a layer, which is really, in many ways, a societally impacted, developed layer that these parents and these kids have to work through.
When you were talking about him changing his way of relating or showing up for his, what he had, his daughter, and then his son now, and how he had
Yeah.
to.
Yeah.
That is, again, isn't that society's construct of saying, like, I had to protect my daughter, and I don't. He has to protect his son too, right? We all, a child is a child, and the protection that you need, that I feel. I think I would be equally as protective over my son as my daughter as my, non-binary child. Like, it would make, I still care, the same level of care for them, I hope.
But it's a comfort coming from a familiarity around how to show up. And so you're putting people by, because ultimately you want that parent to make that child physically and psychologically safe. And so by putting them in I see what you see is perpetuating the bias. I get that. I totally
Yeah.
the challenge, but I also think that if that is a part of the journey towards, becoming more informed and not biased, then at least it's a part on the journey where you can show up meaningfully for that child
Mm-hmm.
as a parent, with comfort and ease, as opposed to, how you met those parents
Mm-hmm.
part of that journey.
Yeah. I definitely accompanied them on a journey. That sure has continued, right?
Yeah, and you just talked about parenting. You've been on that journey yourself in a way, like with your own child. So I guess now you relate to the parents even more than you ever have in your career. How was that for you relating to your child now when you found when they decided they were non-binary?
Well, it was quite a wake-up call. Um, yeah, I mean, I don't think I was pretending in the sense of like, I know everything, I've got this all figured out. Um, but I really thought I had done hard, deep work on my biases and my boxes. And it's very, very different when who you're talking to is your own child. So I absolutely had to explore on a much deeper kind of visceral cellular level, what was I bringing to these conversations? What was I bringing to my own parenting? And then in turn, what was I bringing into my practice?
Mm.
Based on my own ideas about what it meant to be raising so and so, and now I'm raising this other person. And I think my own parallel around in conjunction to this dad I'm talking about, my own parallel in terms of examining what expectations and agenda I had for my own kid. What hopes I had that were really gender based that I hadn't thought of as being gender based. As I hadn't had to, right? I think that's so often the case is if we don't have to do that layer of looking, we're probably not going to do it. So I'm incredibly grateful for that experience, but it's painful. It's not easy. And I think just another piece of that is that I also now really appreciate, I had been doing this work for 7 years, very, very openly, very clearly. I was not the first person my kid came out to.
Mm.
That's an ego blow. I totally understand it at first, like, on a very theoretical, like, well, the parents rarely are. Why would you be any different? But man, that was
Yeah, I can see that.
yeah. So
think
there's a lot of pieces to that I think honestly there's probably still ways that I'm unpacking that and will continue to. And particularly, there's a new phase of life. My eldest is 17. They're about to graduate high school. They're about to go off to college, right? Launch into the world, launch into their adulthood. What does that mean?
Well, that was my point about parenting is a journey and not a destination anyway. And at every stage, there is a grieving. Like my children are now 10 and coming up for 7. And all of that kind of, and I think that's nobody is the set, like you kind of have a core, don't you, in this idea of a sort of soul. But as you develop and live through experiences and situations and circumstances, that shapes who you are and it evolves. And the dance that we do with everyone around us is to kind of continue to kind of be in relationship and healthy relationship with those that are in that immediate circle. I think this is kind of like, because of the societal and cultural, discomfort, fear, whatever it is that's driving that disconnect, it exaggerates this. But I do see it. I thought it was really insightful as you described it, as it's kind of parenting with another layer. There's this other, it's causing you need you to go deeper. It needs you to reflect more on your own, the way that you show up and your attitudes and your behaviors and your belief, which parenting does do on a daily basis, but maybe not to that level.
Yes. I mean, long before I entered into this realm, I would say when I would do like parent coaching, I would say, if anything will make you a Buddhist, parenting will. Right? Like it is this daily constant reminder of like, you don't have control over this. You just don't. Let go of that illusion. Right? But man, this is like a crash course. Okay? It's a crash course in that.
I do also have some questions from a child's perspective. So the children that you see in your clinic, how are they, how are they presenting with this kind of, especially in a world that isn't geared up for them, that is hostile a lot of the time to the way they are, the way they just show up in their lives, the way they feel when they feel most comfortable in the way when they feel safe enough to be something that they want to be in the world. The rest of the world, a lot of the world, is hostile towards them. How does that affect them, and how does that impact them?
Well, I'm sure you're not, I'm sure you're aware of the statistics, on a more kind of global or national level in terms of the mental health status for these kids. And there's evidence now that's not even just correlating, but it's actually causality that this transphobic society that we're living in and this transphobic legislation is directly connected to rises in suicide rates and very negative mental health outcomes. There's also consistent data over and over again that one affirming adult, and it doesn't have to be a parent, but just one affirming adult in a trans or non-binary or gender diverse child's life is enough, right, to really change the equation in terms of the outcome, mental health outcomes, academic outcomes, social outcomes for these kids. So on a more intimate level, in terms of in my own practice, I'm definitely seeing kids who sadly from a young age are aware of their mortality in a way that seems unusual, that are aware of threats, that are just keenly aware of kind of who's around me, lots of checking behavior. So it's a lot of traumatized behavior, honestly. There's a lot of code switching that these kids are doing. Is this a safe space? No. How do I enter that? As opposed to, spaces that are very, very friendly and affirming and, how can I be there? And parents are navigating that alongside them. So I'm seeing kids who are anxious, I'm seeing kids who are distracted. Um, and I'm also seeing kids who just, I think they just want to be, they're just kids. They just want to play. They want to be silly. Um, they don't want to think about this stuff. Um, they're quite normal, right? But these, again, is kind of the same thing I was saying before, like this added layer is like either something they have to work through or something that it kind of creates a container, I guess, for them, that like how much beyond that can they go, right? How much how much can their authentic, confident self develop within an environment that in many cases is saying, we don't want you to be here, or we don't know what to do with you.
And when they have to spend so much of their time and attention thinking, worrying,
Yeah.
scanning environments for cues of safety or acceptance, there's no wonder, because that takes a lot of energy. That takes a lot of focus.
Yeah.
Mm.
I will also say that these kids are amazing in terms of sense of self, right? Like, your first question, what's something I knew in my childhood that, that I've now changed, right? And talked about, well, my idea about gender and about the binary, and that I cannot imagine at 5 years old being so clear about who I am that I could make that kind of declaration, right? And be in spaces and tell people and correct me. I cannot, but I'm meeting these kids, right? And I'm meeting the moms and dads raising these kids. And that is profound to me. On the one hand, I think that's trauma in and of itself, because I think that is requiring a cognitive ability well beyond a 5-year-old's capacity. And I think they are masters in terms of like internal knowledge and being able to read themselves and being able to tune in. I think they just are really, their empathy, I think their self-compassion can be quite profound. And that those are beautiful gifts. Those are wonderful things in our world. We need more of that.
That's also part of post-traumatic growth, though, isn't it? That can happen with the trauma that's the growth, and hopefully that will be spread beyond them really, and come to like, so that we can kind of see that and learn from what that they've had to go through, really, to make a better society in a sense. And another question about you said there's good data to show that it takes one affirming adult to reduce those horrendous statistics. Now, how can me as a parent, or our audience as people, be that one affirming adult? What can we do to make sure that we are that affirming adult if that happens? Yeah.
Well, I was saying before, the number one thing is believe them, right? So when a kid tells you who they are, believe them. I hear you. I believe you.
We've heard that before in a different context, but I think
Yeah. Yeah.
believe.
Yeah. And the work of understanding, like, that can be a long road. And that's separate from the relationship with that young person, right? So your work of understanding the whys and hows and where to's and what happens next, like that may be work, particularly with a parent and child, that they may be doing some co-navigating of that together. But a parent's, but particularly a kind of a parent's kind of landing and grounding in that's really the work that they need to be doing separate from their kid.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that's in their own therapy. Maybe that's in a support group. Maybe that's reading every possible thing they can get their hands on. But we don't have to respect and love and affirmation can come without understanding. We cannot understand and still say, but you can be who you know yourself to be. You know yourself better than I do. Right? That kind of message. So I think that's number one.
Right.
If you're leading from that place, a lot of good things follow, I think. Right.
I think that's true. And like, I mean, it's from a parenting perspective, just accept for, like kind of lean in and, don't, either go dive into fix it mode, reject it mode, or, you know, paper over it mode. I think that's, just believe and be present,
Mhm.
give the
Mhm.
physical and psychological safety that the world might not be offering up in other ways, shapes, or forms. In a world of increasing fear and anxiety and doubt, whether we look at our own internal environments, conflicts, the kind of community, well, family, colleagues, community, society, the macro geopolitical landscape, climate change, there's a lot. So if you had one lever for change, one button to push, one thing that you think would be the right place to start for the change that we need to see, what would that thing be?
I had some really profound experiences interviewing parents um, across the country, and I went to 4 different Midwest states, visited family and friends while I was doing that, alongside meeting new people. And the biggest takeaway from all of 2024, honestly, including coming to the event in Oxford, which was fantastic. You put on quite an event. I hope to come again. Was that when I showed up as my most authentic self and said, "This is who I am. This is what matters to me." 9 times out of 10, people met me there. People met me with that energy of like, yes, let's be real about who we are and what we're trying to do here. Um, Even when it was hard. So I think there's something about being willing to have dialogue across differences, across ideological differences, and being willing to show up as our authentic selves, and then listen. And then listen to what the person has to say. I think that's what's going to move us. I gotta believe that, right? I feel like I'm hanging a lot on that right now. Is that ability that we are meant to be in community with one another, and the only way we can do that is by showing up as our true selves, and then listening to the other.
Beautiful. Thank you, Rachel. It's been a pleasure having you with us today. I've really
Thank
enjoyed
you.
it, and it's definitely, provoked me to think differently about how I can show up, and but also just understanding those implicit biases and how much they're driving discomfort and, you know, not fertile ground for living authentically, which, as you've just explained, is the root cause to the foundation for, a better humanity.
Yeah, it's been such a really great conversation. I think having conversations like these, difficult, just but showing up authentically, like you just said, I really love that answer. I think that is how, people are going to make mistakes, people are going to get it wrong, like you said, and that's what stops these conversations from happening. And we need to not stop those. We need to keep having them and keep making mistakes and getting it wrong until one day we kind of get it right. I think that's been really what I've taken away from this conversation. So thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, you too. Appreciate it. It's a really pleasure getting to know you.